Welcome to our program today. We are very excited that we are launching our 2023-24 academic year with this particular program today. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland in College Park. And I just want to remind us that today's program is also co-sponsored by the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, as well as the anti-Black racism initiative, also in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. A reminder to our viewers that today's program is being recorded. I would like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, for all that she does in organizing events for us, and in particular, today's event. And of course, a warm welcome to our speakers, whom it is my pleasure to introduce to you. Today's scholars take on the fascinating topic of the impact of place and the currency of the corridors of our democracy, and how such contours impact the way we see, we experience, and we envision democratic processes. Doctors Martin and Way begin by taking us all the way back to the Greek Agora, that place of meeting, of discussion and debate, of social, spiritual, and civic interest. They remind us that such discussions are fundamental to some of our most basic and revered human values. Both scholars study the motivating engagements of places where we live, how our human settlements impact the way we self-organize and combine to seek a public good. They also examine how the intersection or the intersecting realities of gender, race, class, and culture combine to form places within places, microclimates of limits and possibilities that make our worlds ever more complex, ever more fascinating. So it's my pleasure to now introduce our speakers. First, Dr. Samantha Martin, who is an associate professor in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Environmental Policy at the University College Dublin. Her main research and teaching interests lie in classical antiquity and the phenomenology of landscapes. She is the editor of Food and Architecture at the Table and co-editor of Mobs and Microbes, Market Halls, Civic Order, and Public Health. Her other book projects include New Directions in Ancient Urban Planning in the Mediterranean, and a forthcoming monograph on the urban order of ancient Athens. She is presently the editor-in-chief of Architectural Histories, the field journal of the European Architectural History Network. Dr. Martin has long worked on archaeological excavations, beginning in 1999 in the Athenian Agora and later at the Lochfent Archaeological Project in Albania. Most recently, she has served as architectural historian for the Methosi Archaeological Project in northern Greece. Sorry about the pronunciation. She even helped me with them. Dr. Martin has won many awards for her teaching, including a 2019 College Teaching Award at the University College Dublin. In 2021, she was a Mellon Teaching Fellow at the Dumbarton Oaks, Washington, D.C., where actually I live very close to. She is currently Senior Associate Member of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Dr. Martin completed her PhD in architecture from the University of Cambridge in 2007. Before that, she received the Master of Philosophy in History and Philosophy of Architecture, also from Cambridge. She is a graduate of Smith College. Welcome, Dr. Martin. Our second scholar is Dr. Thaisa Wei, who is a fellow in American Society of Landscape Architects and the director for Garden and Landscape Studies at Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection, which is a Harvard University research institution located in Washington, D.C. She is the principal investigator of a Mellon initiative called Democracy and Urban Landscape, Race, Identity, and Difference. As a landscape historian, she teaches history, theory, and design at the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. She was awarded a Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture at the American Academy in Rome in 2016. Dr. Wei served as the founding director of Urban at UW, an initiative of the University of Washington. Her publications foreground questions of history, gender, and shaping the landscape. Her book, entitled Unbounded Practices, Women, Landscape Architecture, and Early 20th Century Design, was awarded the J.B. Jackson Book Award. Another book entitled From Modern Space to Urban Ecological Design, The Landscape Architecture of Richard Haig, explores the narrative of post-industrial cities and practices of landscape architecture. Another book, River Cities / River, contributes to urban and environmental history. And GGN 1999 to 2018 is a foray into the descriptions of design as a process. Her most recent book, Segregation and Resistance in Urban Landscapes, is co-edited with Eric Avila. Dr. Wei has a PhD from Cornell University and a Master's of Architecture History from the University of Virginia. It is really an honor to have both of them with us today, and now I turn the time over to them.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to try this again. Hopefully it will work as it did before. Okay, and thank you for that incredibly lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure for both of us to be here, and we're immensely grateful for the invitation. So Thais and I are going to be exploring the idea of land and place as the foundation of public discourses and in turn democracy, beginning with an inquiry into the role of the Agora as a place of debate and discussion and dissent. We're then going to consider how the land on which we make public places shapes and is shaped by the engagement of democratic discourses. For nearly 25 years, I have been working in one of the most recognized sites in the history of architecture, the Athenian Agora, the civic center of ancient Athens. But much of what I'm putting forward in today's talk, in fact, is indeed an argument for unlearning some of the canonical ways that we have for looking at the Agora. Now, in the wider public imagination, the classical period of Athens is referred to as the so-called Golden Age of Greece, a period of productive and unfettered artistic and architectural expression, political transformation, and philosophical innovation. The Agora has conventionally been considered as like the heartbeat of the city, the wellspring of democracy. As soon as the word Agora is mentioned in a conversation, it almost unfailingly summons an architectural setting. For many, this setting is the classical Agora of Athens, two representations that you see here. It's famous for its stoas. These are the long colonnaded halls, its civic offices, and its law courts. Now, scholars of ancient Greece will remind us that there are many agoras all over the entire Greek world, and that is indeed the case. But nonetheless, it's this location, it's this particular agora, the Agora of Athens, which is almost always bringing to mind, first and foremost, an architectural ensemble, like you see here. Occasionally, there is a corrective to this, pointing out that our standard rendition of Agora precludes the clutter and the transitory activities that characterize all political meeting places. This not only prompts us to widen our picture of this institutional setting, but it also obliquely calls out the pitfalls of producing these very tidy, almost clinically functional architectural renderings. Whereas architectural representations may help us to cipher a site and give us a great insight as well into what these sites originally looked like, these drawings rarely try to record the messes and the uncertainties and even the strangeness of everyday life. Sometimes people do make an effort and to display the busyness of these places. And here is an example. This is supposed to be the classical Athenian Agora. And you wouldn't be able to have this viewpoint today. So there's a lot of artistic license in this as well. But this is going some way to trying to stymie this assumption that at the center of the Agora is a void. Put simply, an agora without people is an empty concept. So we need to invert this common assumption that the unbuilt space of that agora was some sort of blank canvas. This is a working political landscape. It was not open in the vacant sense of all, but rather filled with dialogue and debate and consensus. Now, the logical course of action here is to pull away from this orthodoxy of understanding democracy through buildings and instead prioritize the ground itself. In doing so, we acknowledge that the Greek agora was a phenomenon that was not merely a physical location, but also an assembly of people. Seeing the agora as a political landscape prioritizes the nature of assembly itself. This approach is by no means groundbreaking, but it is a revisiting, rather, of the ancient sources, in particular Aristotle. And his very first line of the Politics, Aristotle tells us that every city, every polis, is a koinonia, which is defined as a partnership, and every partnership is formed with a view to some good. And because it was mentioned just sort of when passing in the introduction, and I didn't translate it here, but the common good is toin koinon agathon, the common good. So this word koinonia is rooted in the word common. What Aristotle is saying here is that cities in essence are a collective of people who have something, or indeed many things, in common. An orientation towards a higher good enables the many different, even unequal parts of a partnership to be seen as one entity. And I would go further than this and to argue that it's not merely the people, but it's also those activities of those people that comprise the koinonia. Athens was a koinonia, and its agora was the fulcrum of this partnership. And many of these activities in the agora were not merely functional, but also agonal. That is, they embraced conflict. The principal definition of agora is assembly. Thus, while today the mention of an agora immediately evokes that architectural image, its primary definition, in fact, highlights the underlying fundamental significance of a gathering of people. In other words, an agora could pretty much be nearly anywhere because the basic need of a community is the ability to congregate freely for debate and dissent. The deep-seated condition is evident in how the noun agora is derived from the verb aguero, which means to gather or to assemble. It must be emphasized that while context is important, it is in fact the social ability to congregate that's vital, not the capacity of those assembled to have a permanent architectural home. This is well attested, for example, in Homer, where an agora is something that's summoned and is created by a gathering of people for an agon, a contest of words. Agon, too, is closely related, as you can see from the slide, to the word agora, and it's sometimes even defined as being an assembly, but it can also mean a struggle or a place of contest or to contend for victory. In Homeric epic, an agora was not articulated by architecture, but rather by human beings and the relationships between them, namely speech and vision. These assemblies literally took shape when warriors gathered around, marking off a space for something. The arrangement and positioning of their bodies delineated the agora, and they communally recognized and deliberated over whatever stood in that middle. The action of marking off the land to deliberate and to engage in dialectic becomes the central condition of the classical agora. Now, sometimes something which is quite small and discrete can be remarkable and can hold the key to understanding a place. The agora had no walls, no fences, no formal architectural barriers. Instead, it had boundary stones. So a photograph here of it in situ. These are about 1 meter high, and 2 drawings. These were placed at specific points, usually at crossroads or along the pavement on the way into the agora. And they very literally speak to us. They read, Horos imites agora. I, in the first person, I am the boundary of the agora, as if they were living persons. They were protected by the gods, and thus it makes sense that they were given special status and animated, somewhat like totems. The word horos is where we get our English word horizon. And the Greek term horismos means boundary or limit. But this is not a blunt, final point. Instead, it's attuned to what lies beyond and outside of what it is marking. Now, our modern habit of prioritizing the agora as an architectural set piece has effectively contaminated our ability to understand ancient landscapes, especially political ones. And what I'm showing you here is a perspective reconstructed of the view from the middle of the Athenian agora looking west. And this is a beautiful drawing, and I certainly do not want to take away from this. But what I will say is that it is more like a stage set. It is virtually devoid of life. Regardless of time or location, landscape is never static, never inert. Agon is a useful vehicle for understanding the essential function of the agora, but it can be challenging to visualize and represent this. While epigraphers and historians have meticulously tabulated speeches, litigations, trials, and not to mention some of the more sordid activities that took place in the agora, archaeologists and architects have been slower to help us appreciate the role of Agon in the daily life of the city. One way of explaining this is to look beyond politics and beyond philosophy and to focus on the agones, or contests, that occasionally took place in the agora. Now, agones were staged in most Greek cities and sanctuaries, usually at festivals for something like the Olympic Games. Most of the time, agones took place in specially built facilities like stadia. But in Athens, one of these athletic contests was staged right in the middle of the agora, from this point of view that you're still looking at. And it's called the Apovates competition, and it involved racing chariots and warriors. I'm showing you here one of our earliest depictions of one of these events. This is on the lid from a vase. In a nutshell, this contest consisted of a race between 4-horse chariots. While the charioteer maneuvered his steeds along through the agora, the job of the apovates was to dismount the racing chariot, sprint against the other warriors, perhaps engage in combat, and then run and remount the chariot while it was moving. In antiquity, this took place on the broad thoroughfare that ran across the agora. This is called the Pan-Athenaic Way. And in antiquity, it was known as what we call a dromos, which carries a dual meaning as both a public walkway and a racecourse. The boundary between spectators and spectacle was highly permeable. While we do have evidence of grandstands, temporary grandstands, that is, at some locations along the path of the Pan-Athenaic Way, there is no evidence whatsoever of any safety barriers or barricades like we would see today. Bystanders surely understood their participation could end up being much more than mere observation. The Apovates race in the Athenian Agora stands out as an explicit, even exaggerated example of agon. It's an exceptional event because it helps us understand and certainly visualize how conflict in the Greek city was something acknowledged and given a formal outlet. Our contemporary predilection to view conflict in the city as something unilaterally unhealthy and therefore negative fails to understand its legitimate function. Conflict is not only useful, but also necessary to a city. Expunging conflict, attempting to staunch it, builds barriers to communication and fuels something else, stasis. As we all well know, the unreconciled breakdown in communication inevitably slides into uncontrolled outbursts of violence. And thus, the Apovates race can be seen as one example of how the Agora made space for conflict, be it through competition, petitioning, rabble-rousing, or dialectic. These forms of conflict diffused other much more dangerous hostilities and perhaps resolved some of the maligned aggression before it tipped over into sedition. But there's one other layer to understanding the Apovates and the Agora, and this has to do with the ground, the literal soil of the Agora itself. This sport, a militaristic equestrian competition featuring Athenian cavalrymen, was an atavistic event that recalled the ancestral past of Homeric heroes and legendary warriors. It is notable that some Apovates races on Greek vases depict key warriors from the Iliad, and it is also notable that many of these vases were used for funerary settings. Certainly, the story of Achilles downing Hector, which is illustrated here, these pervaded Greek literature, but it's a much closer context that's often under-acknowledged. The connection between the Apovates race with tradition and legend is made all the more real when we take account of the history of the ground of the Athenian Agora itself. For this landscape had earlier been the original keramikos of the city, the burial ground. Thus, the Agora was not created on a tabula rasa. It was not a blank slate. Rather, this was already a place that was thoroughly suffused with meaning and history. The Apovates race took place atop the graves of ancestors, tapping into an august legacy while also celebrating as well as legitimizing the prowess of Athenian athletes. Ultimately, through years of research, and then especially during my time as a fellow at Dumbarton Oaks, I dispensed with the idea of an architecture of democracy altogether. And I came to see the Athenian Agora instead as a landscape of democracy. That the Agora is a political landscape is incontestable. However, this shift in orientation of defining this place also requires a literal change in view from our part. When I first started working at this site, images of buildings almost always depicted the outside looking in. A number of years ago, I made the simple decision to invert this viewpoint and to reconstruct views through buildings towards the center of the Agora. In a way, this was such a basic thing to do. And yet this decision opened up a new avenue of understanding the role of the Agora as an agonal gathering place and site of dissent. Athenians, of course, looked both toward and into these buildings from the center of the Agora, but we had forgotten that they also just as frequently gazed through and out of them. From this perspective, we cannot fail to see how the open ground of the Agora is replete with physical activity, political activity, from the mundane and the everyday to the spectacular. So I'm going to pass the baton on to Thaisa.
Thank you, Samantha. So many communities have considered place in the land as critical within their cultural practices. And in a democracy, as Samantha noted, Democracy without a place for discourse and debate is empty, as an agora without people is an empty concept. Next. If we move our attention, can you go to next slide? If we move our attention to a different time and place, the early years of what was described as a new democracy in the recently independent United States and the building of its capital in the District of Columbia on the lands of the Lenape Nation and others, we might consider the role of place as it emerged through our continual efforts to build such a democracy. We are familiar with L'Enfant's plan for the Capitol as a geographical embodiment of the US Constitution, the Capitol building located on the highest spot, with the president's house on another hill a mile away and the river then to the far left. The centerpiece of L'Enfant's vision here on the mall, as I've noted here, is the public lands, the mall connecting the Capitol and White House with a monument to George Washington. Next. President's Park has a long history as a place of public gathering in this plan for ceremony and free expression. It was included in L'Enfant's plans, although were then enclosed under President Thomas Jefferson. However, neither the wall nor the fence could keep people out, as was noted by each of the early presidents who daily greeted visitors allowed to stroll the grounds. After the War of 1812, the park was cleared and planted with elms and eastern red cedars as a public park designed by the architect Charles Bulfinch. Reflecting its public character, the place holds multiple stories. In 1810, an enslaved woman named Alethea Browning Tanner purchased her freedom with $1,400 she had earned selling vegetables in what we now know of as Lafayette Square. As I will emphasize in a moment, in 1917, quote, every day the women with their banners marched across the park to take up positions in front of the White House. Lafayette Square was where participants gathered in 1963 as they prepared for the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, and when Martin Luther King would give his I Have a Dream speech. Next. The public park, though truly emerged as an American urban landscape in the mid-19th century, was Central Park in New York City. Best known for this design with Calvert Vaux, Frederick Law Olmsted drew from his visits to Birkenhead Park in England, writing, quote, 5 minutes of admiration and a few more spent in studying the manner in which art had been employed to obtain from nature so much beauty. And I was ready to admit that in democratic America, there was nothing to be thought of as comparable with this people's garden. And further, I was glad to observe that the privileges of the garden were enjoyed about equally by all classes. Olmsted believed the built environment could promote democratic values and behaviors and set himself the task of designing spaces that would match the nation's assumed democratic aims and aspirations. In this belief, he reflected his expanded understanding of the conflicts within democracy, particularly apparent in his writings of the South in the 1850s, when he traveled through the South to write a journal and understand the economy, the place, and the culture. In this, he foresaw that slave labor was and would tear the country apart. The system of enslavement could not fulfill the ideals and the potential of a democratic nation, he argued. He saw plantations as small universities upon themselves, universes upon themselves, not universities, feudal societies, not democracies. His time living, in fact, within these plantations and traveling drove him to call for what he called a public infrastructure for a democratic community. Olmsted believed that democracy was the highest form of civilization, requiring citizens who are physically and psychologically fortified so that each benefits the community at large. As he wrote, it is of great importance in the first real park made in this country, a democratic development of the highest significance, and the success of which, in my opinion, much the progress of art and aesthetic culture in this country is dependent. Parks would transform individuals living in crowded cities by bringing them into a more natural world, a healing that happened when in connection with this natural world. And parks would bring this transformation into a shared experience where community could be built. Olmsted believed parks would hasten the emergence of a broad-minded public spirit that could transcend the ever-pressing factional politics. Public parks might be spaces that promoted community building, where community signals not identities understood as sameness or commonality, but the capacity to coexist peacefully. He felt that parks were creating a harmonizing and refining influence favorable to courtesy, self-control, and temperance. Next. And yet it is equally critical to note, that Central Park displaced the very citizens he claims to have wanted to benefit. Most significantly, Seneca Village is shown here, a community of African Americans who had established a thriving place in the landscape of New York. Next. In the 1901, this is only a 15-minute talk, so I'm going through history quite fast. In 1901, post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, in the midst of expanding Jim Crow and violent segregation, the focus returned to the nation's capital, where conflicts continued to be present in the public realm. Next, the Macmillan Plan of 1902 returned to L'Enfant's Plan, with its center once again featuring the public lands in the form of the National Mall. Expansive lawn lined by elm trees connecting each part of the government. One might read the mall not as a void, but as a center of the capital slowly developed over, you can see, the next 60 years. One might describe this vision of the mall as a performance of democracy, a place where the grandeur of ideas and the nation could be viewed, heard, and experienced. This was not yet a place of active debate or conflict, but of cultural aspirations, particularly of the elite. Next. And yet, while the descriptions of the mall and that of parks remain focused on the ways in which public lands brought citizens together to create community and to be transformed by their experience in nature, this public land at the center of the government soon hosted additional purposes and activities and gatherings, most clearly that of protest. The earliest organized protest on the mall that we know of was Coxey's petition in Boots against the federal government's failure to assist the populace during an economic depression. In this way, the mall was slowly becoming a place that Samantha has described, a place that might hold conflict, that would be a ground of discourse, debate, and democracy. It was a place for what Diane Davies has termed the physicality of citizenship and democracy. Next. However, what likely truly altered the idea of the National Mall was the way in which women would take up their place in that place. Building on a century of community and civic engagement in clubs and in societies, as well as more recently in some of the professions of teaching, design, and nursing, women had learned the power of staking a place in the public realm, in community, and with a clear message, one worthy of the attention of the democracy. Women furthered this physicality by organizing a parade, note the clear choreography, and a stand-in protest that both placed their demands on the grounds of the democratic nation and thus modeled a form of dispute and debate among citizens and their leaders within a democracy. And as you can see in the top right, the image of the women in Lafayette Park, the President's Park, in their stand-in in front of the White House. Next. The civil rights movement would further transform the National Mall from a place of performance to one of where enacting democracy was at its core. From the performance of Marian Anderson in 1939, a cultural event that brought conflict into the public realm in a manner that also suggested a vision of a more just future, where it was this community that would comprise a true democracy. As she sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee," when she got to the third line of that well-known song, she made a change. Instead of thee I sing, she sang, to thee we sing. Her change of lyric from I to we can be heard as an embrace, implying a larger community and a group democracy. Almost 30 years later, when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech from the same grounds, he too described a physicality of citizenship that was grounded in the public landscape of the National Mall and all it represented, it literally, metaphorically, and as you can see, physically, literally a stage in front of an audience. Next. Resurrection City occurred in 1968 as part of the Poor People's Campaign, transforming the march into an extended occupation of the National Mall, bringing 3,000 people to build a utopian do-it-yourself collectivism, as they called it. The occupation of Alcatraz was a 19-month-long protest of 89 Native Americans and their supporters who occupied Alcatraz Island, building also a model for community in place, reclaiming the land that had been stolen and reestablishing their relationship to the place and the land in this democracy. Next. Parks were increasingly used not merely for recreation, but as with the mall, places for public engagement in government, in conflict and in celebration, in memory and envisioning a more ideal future, a place where the conflicts and discourses of democracy would be brought to the nation's attention. Next, what is of equal interest and worthy of more research is how these acts of citizenship and discourse move from the public parks, places designated for occupation, to the infrastructure of streets and transportation, notably in this one, in the Longest Walk, which occurred in 1978 when Native Americans gathered on Alcatraz again to launch a pilgrimage to Washington, D.C., the fourth in 10 years. Next. This was not merely American democracy. Elsewhere in the world, citizens were claiming place for imagining a different future on their own grounds. Tahrir, meaning liberation in Arabic, became a symbol of freedom and rebellion of the Egyptian people, and controversial place historically and in the visioning of democracy and self-government. Surrounded with historical buildings of modern Cairo, the square witnessed the first protests against the British in 1946. And following the July 1952 revolution, which turned Egypt into a republic, in 1953, the name was changed to Tahrir, Liberation Square. It was a place of the Arab Spring uprising in 2011, leading to President Mubarak stepping down, and where millions of Egyptians converged, filling the streets and the place with their voices and body, making their demands parent on place, a physicality of citizenship. The power of place is evident in the recent redesign, which has for many revolutionaries covered over the traces of Arab Spring and the legacy of democracy. The ground, once again, a place for conflict and debate, has now been inscribed with ancient symbols of immense power and authority. Next. I want to focus again, as did Samantha, on the idea of ground as the place, the land where our history is held and our democracy has been debated and strengthened, weakened and challenged, stewarded and strengthened. This acknowledgement is nowhere more powerful than in the holding of soil at the Equal Justice Initiative and the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, where their memorialization happens in large part through visits to lynching sites, collecting the soil and erecting the public markers in an effort to reshape the cultural landscape. As they note, quote, community coalitions who complete community soil collection and narrative historical marker projects, and pursue other independent community efforts to foster dialogue and remembrance, help raise local consciousness of racial history, and help foster dialogue about the connections to contemporary issues, and further develop a communal identity that prioritizes historical truth-telling and repair. Next. This engagement of democracy in place, the role of the ground, the land in the shaping of democracy and our relationship to citizenship, I think becomes increasingly clear. When we use these lands to protest and debate, when these events are choreographed to reflect the communities and cultures engaged, we make places to celebrate, to stand for change, and recently to come together as we face COVID across communities, nations, and the world. Next. Place matters to democracy. The public realm is a fundamental platform and place of our political process, and it is essential that we not let it be stolen incrementally or impulsively. Thank you. And I think with that, we would love to hear comments and questions from all of you.
Thank you both so much. So attendees can use the Q&A function to type in your questions for the speakers. And while we give people time, I'm going to ask you a quick question myself so that we have some time for the audience to type in their questions. So the question I had was in relation to how the regulation of the public space has changed. So I'm thinking of the protests that you were talking about on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and now this need and requirement for having a permit to hold a protest, and what that does in terms of the ability of citizens to have a dialogue, to put forward their opinion. How do you think that has reshaped the public spaces?
Well, I guess that's a very long question, as in there's a long answer, but I would begin with, so there has been the requirement for some kind of license or permission, actually going all the way back. And in fact, the Coxey's protest in Boots, he was arrested because they were not allowed. The idea was you did not use the National Mall, the sign of our government place, as a place of protest. But by 1913, the suffrage women were able to use it. And then, of course, Marian Anderson, I think that concert in 1939 is a really pivotal point where it was used as well as a place of protest, but also a place of a particular kind of protest. And I would say this really leads to a question of how women were using these places, and then other communities, non-white particularly communities, were thinking, the civil rights movement were thinking of using these places in much more complex ways than merely just marching, right? And that's partly what I tried to show. However, there's a whole history of who gets permission to do it, and when and where. It continues to be a contested piece. But as part of our democracy, I guess I would argue it should be contested, right? You should be able to be there. And at the same time, we have to make sure there aren't too many people. That sounds lame, but right, we need to regulate this. It is one place, and it is an incredibly important place to the nation. So I think some curating of it, yeah, that's a longer conversation, how they decide who gets to do that. And I think we've all been involved in, right, those discussions of who has permission, when and where to gather.
Thank you. So the first audience question that we have comes from Tahir Haroon. Is the claim that our landmarks and parks or agoras affect where people congregate, and that affects our democracy? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, I'll go ahead and let Samantha chime in about it. I would say it absolutely does impact our democracy is when we make the places, so that evolution of the National Mall and the idea of using parks and then eventually using streets and squares and such, sort of what we might call the infrastructure, allows democracy to actually happen. I think in many ways it can't happen if there isn't a place in the public realm for that conflict and that debate and discourse. I think in turn it shapes our built environment, because we are always thinking about those questions you just brought up, which is how do we design the places that, say, parks that can serve recreational purposes and community building, and a place of protest, and a place of celebration, and a place in a public health crisis. Obviously, part of what I'm arguing is this is why these places in the public realm are so critical. I'll add one more piece because I want Samantha to talk about in terms of the Agora. I also think it is actually the design of these places, and we couldn't really get into that, but I think there is something powerful about these lawns surrounded by trees. There's a porosity. You can get it, but you know when you're in it, you know when you're out, you can move in and out, right? There are all sorts of reasons why particular designs, as well as obviously the location of the National Mall next to the government, and linking literally the mall is right, the thread that links all the buildings together. But Samantha?
It's a great topic, and we could definitely go on for a long time on that. I was actually just talking with my students, my master's students yesterday, about a very, very similar kind of conversation, whereby we were discussing hierarchies in space. And certainly the Agora of Athens in particular was the place of enfranchisement. That is where you exercised your citizenship. Today, we have such a loose idea of that because we can do things remotely. You know, as an American citizen, I can print out a federal ballot here in my room in Dublin and send it and have it counted, you know, whereas you had to engage in order to exercise your citizenship in a very public way. But we also had this really interesting conversation about notions of hierarchy in the public realm, and so many of these places which have endured and which people are drawn to, it's sometimes difficult to actually define them architecturally. The more formal and planned they are from the top down, the often less successful they are, and often even more dictatorial and totalitarian. We have a student in my master's class right now who is originally from Romania. And so we had this really interesting conversation about the notion of vagueness, actually, in a place like the Agora. And we often think of the word vague as being negative or being somehow something we want to avoid. But actually, vague can be very positive too, because it means that you have that porosity, or more of a chance for that porosity of permeable boundaries of people being able to come and go. It's not a free-for-all, but there is it's more than just a flexibility of design as well. There's a give and a take in terms of the spatial hierarchy and the scale of buildings. Certainly, they're very accessible, and they're more human scale than being, you know, overwhelming. But it's more complicated than that, and it's something that we're just as, you know, the world that Thais and I inhabit tends to be the more architectural history, landscape history world. And we're almost just starting to kind of come to terms with how to talk about these places, how to be really specific about something that actually is important because it has ambiguity to it.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Clara Iratzabal. How do social media and newer developments, virtual reality, metaverse, AI, interact with physical public space? How do they enhance, hinder, complement, or threaten it? And what should we do to maintain and nurture the importance of public space for democracy and human social interaction?
Well, I'll give just a very quick yes. I think that the fact that we can talk on Threads or Instagram, it certainly opens up conversation, but democracy actually depends on a much deeper and more engaged discourse, and that happens in place. And I think we see that whether as teachers, that there is a kind of learning and discourse that happens in the classroom in person, and certainly in politics and in a democracy and around our most important ideas. We need to come together, and I'd be enhanced by social media, you know, maybe be connected to the organizing, but I think in the end you need to come into a place, and you need to be able to come into a place that you can engage with, that there is a certain level of safety for you to engage, and that's what the public realm ought to be providing.
Yeah, I agree. I think certainly, I know the Arab Spring, a lot of that was organized through Twitter, and that's remarkable. But I would also like to put a voice out there for the things which often don't have a voice, because there are things like olfactory, you know, other sensory things that one feels and notices and engages with when they are actively participating in democratic space. I took my daughter, for example, to her first ever march when we were in Washington. It was the Women's March, and I think what really struck her on that day was that, you know, the actual, not just the sound, but the feeling of having those bodies together. And someone like Richard Sennett, sociologist who is very interested in the built environment, is, you know, he's slightly on the outside of our discipline, but he has this amazing view in, and he talks about the actual, you know, the jostling of bodies and how that is so important to engaging in democratic space. I'm not against you know, virtual reality, and in fact, a lot of these things help us understand the physical environment of places like the Athenian Agora, which exist in ruins. But I have a harder time, maybe it's my generation, signing up for the life of that through the virtual world.
So
Let me just add something else, which again, I think we understand, but we don't articulate. I also think it is important not just to be in person to person, but in a place that grounds us in the larger world. And one of the things that, for example, trees do is remind us of our place in the larger world on this planet, on this earth, and our relationship to place in that way. And I think we sometimes forget. So it's not just being anywhere in person, it's actually being in a place, to go back to Olmsted, that feeds us in some way. And I think that's also an important piece. And that's also something which so far AI can't do.
thank you. That actually fits really nicely with the next question I want to ask, which is from Neda Moayed. How does lack of access due to ability, distance, etc., to the public spaces impact interactions and desired outcomes? Further than, how is involvement and media coverage impacting on those interactions?
No, I guess I'll start up, but Samantha, you should chime in. Obviously, one of the great advantages of the social media technology, Zoom, right? We're doing it right here, right? We're reaching, Samantha is in Ireland, I'm sitting in DC, right? And we can do this. So I think it would be naive and dismissive to claim that that's not a very important part of both helping people learn about issues around the world, but also understand who and what issues are rising, right? I happen to think knowing, you know, having good newspapers and good journalism is critically important. So I think all of that important. I think all of that has to be an and we need to find places to be together and to have debate and conflict. And I guess I just want to emphasize, and this is something that Samantha works on a lot, which is just that role of conflict, because we tend to think that coming together is just coming together with people who are ilk. And I actually think what's really important is to be in those places where when we can know we're going to run into difference and conflict.
Yeah. Actually, 2 points. I mean, the Civil Rights March in Washington, that was such a pivotal event too, because that was one of the first, I think I'm right. It's been a little while since I've read this chapter. But it was really one of the very first large marches that was seen from above because of the infrastructure that the news media outlets had. They were essentially trying it out on that march, so you could see aerial views. And that was disseminated as well because of television all over the world. So there was huge interest in places very, very far away, you know, and that made a map that has created more, that has augmented the legacy. So there is that point, and you know, separate to it is this. I've lost my train of thought here, but when you were talking, Thaisa, about conflict, and oh yes, this is another comment that my students had brought up, I think last week, or maybe it doesn't matter, but this notion of the echo chamber, and you know, there's a difference between not being able to access this public realm and being prevented from doing that, and that's a problem, you know, and being limited because of distance can be a problem too. And I think, like, just to echo what Thaisa was saying, what we're doing right now is is certainly opening up avenues for discussion that some people may never have access to. But actually being in the place, as it coerces you, it implores you to be discomforted sometimes. And that is something that we recognize, but we often also want to push away. And we know this from social media, that people end up falling into these vacuums where they're just listening to the people that they already agree with. So we're not really we're seeing that polarization and actually stasis. And we certainly see this in the United States, where there isn't that space where people who don't get along. I mean, we tend to think of identity as something that makes us distinct, and our difference is part of ourselves. But actually, in antiquity, the difference is what made the city. So you couldn't have a city that was full of equal parts or similar people. You had to have that difference, and they understood that. It was in their DNA. And we've moved away from that an awful long way.
Yeah, the piece though I'd come back to, and in rereading the question, I think the question of access is as much about what's available in your community, right? And obviously coming to DC makes a certain statement, and major political movements have found ways to come to DC to make their arguments. I think this is why the public realm is so important in all of our communities. But I would also say it's underscores the importance of those citizens who have engaged in that physicality of citizenship and made their argument present in their own public realm. And I think of things like after the Dobbs decision and the number of particularly women who got out in communities where the rest of the nation may have assumed they all thought one way, and they got out and made it clear that they actually believed something different, and they wanted people to understand where they stood on these issues. And they did that in the public realm. And so my answer would be that access is really important, and again, why we should be investing in our public realm and thinking about it as not just transportation systems, or economic networks, but actually core to our democracy, so that these happen in all of our communities. And why ADA, why all of these issues around access, segregation need to be addressed. That's a very simple answer to it with a much more complex argument behind it, but great question. Most I want to recognize a really important question.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Malik Wilson. How do you believe that the hidden poetics of particular forms of architecture itself, especially on the National Mall, for example, commutes meaning almost of a spiritual nature? So the ideal of quiet, noble edifice that gestures to a more revered time, keeping priceless objects within. How can debates about architecture and democracy factor in the work of Starchitects and new, bolder Take a Look at Me buildings? Does this reflect or produce a new modern sense of individualism and populism?
That's yours.
That's a very loaded question, and I think it's very, very. It's probably going to be too long to cover entirely. This is part of that is one of the things that I have been looking at and coming to terms with, frankly, for the last couple of years. And I really spent a lot of time in Washington when I was at Dumbarton Oaks thinking about this. I mean, I started out as a classicist, and I'll be really frank, working in the Athenian Agora for generations, not myself for generations, but it has been not everybody understands or is cognizant to the fact that the Athenian Agora in Athens has largely, from its inception as an excavation, been run by the Americans. It has been overseen by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, and so generations of students have been going to Athens. And you wouldn't see this in print, but digging for democracy is something that kind of has been entrenched in the way of thinking. And I have unpacked this quite a lot. There is in the wider public imagination as well a retrojecting of classical ideals back onto our federal architecture. And there's an assumption that these buildings can be three-dimensional representations of political movements, particularly in our case, democracy. Okay, but buildings are rarely as forthcoming as we would like them to be. Something like the architecture parlante of Ledoux in France would be a very unusual exception to that, where buildings literally were shaped as what they were supposed to be doing. And they're seen as more oddities. Our buildings are pretty canonical in their classical rendition, but that doesn't equate with being symbolic of democracy. And the more you start to look at this, the more you have to start to reconcile that the buildings aren't saying as much as you would like, as you would assume them maybe to say. And yet this is a democratic setting. You know, this is the capital of the United States, but there are many other places in the world which bear a resemblance to L'Enfant's plan, and certainly have very, very similar edifices. So you have to start to ask, well, what are we like? Where is the democracy? What are we looking at? How can we find it? And that was something that, you know, it seems very simple and kind of straightforward to say, well, you know, actually look at the ground. But it takes a long time to kind of get to that position, because then how do you describe that ground? How do you visualize it? How, apart from just, you know, making a map or a plan, how do you actually allow people to understand that in a very tangible, concrete way? So I don't really wish to wade too far into the debate of star architecture, but I would say that it doesn't actually matter what what path you are following, what agenda you have when it comes to designing new federal buildings, because it's very, very rare that any single one of those buildings is going to literally embody some kind of political movement. I think it's about looking elsewhere for that. So again, that's a very simple way of kind of covering something which could go on. I have a whole chapter on this actually in my monograph. So, and it's complicated because it requires unlearning and sort of like not just reappraising, but kind of turning on its head assumptions that we didn't even, that they're so natural to us that we don't even realize that we have in us.
And I guess I would just add that what we think of as inspiring on the National Mall is a particular story of democracy in the West that ignores all sorts of other ways. And it's why I wanted to be clear that there are many cultures that, in fact, I would argue most cultures have ways of creating place, and we should just recognize that they tell other stories as well.
Absolutely, thank you. So the next question is from Leslie Gottert. Was the Agora originally used only as a meeting place for dialogue and competition and not political protest? Have you found evidence of demonstrations to protest a government policy or social practice, or the prohibition therefore, or thereof? Sorry. Okay,
so yeah, that's part of that is simple to answer. The other part is a little bit trickier and requires some finesse in epigraphy and historical understanding. The Agora was not just this is one of the brilliant things about that space. It was not just a political meeting place. And if you go through the epigraphical evidence, a lot of which is published through is disseminated through the publications of the American School of Classical Studies, you will see that it is replete with anything and everything, from the selling of fish to there's a house of Simon the Cobbler, which is, you know, debatable, but from the very, you know, the mundane money changing to sex to blasphemy. So you have it's this extremely like sort of messy transitory space where it's not necessarily formal, and those things can overlap in a place as well as a time. So it's not like you would have, certainly you would have days which are set aside for festivals and where the public comes together specifically to celebrate one or two things. But even when those are going on, you still have stuff on the sidelines, just like we have today. Yeah, like it wasn't that much different. But then going back to protests, of course, yes, there is this history of protest in the Agora, but that's much harder to document. And often you have to read kind of literally between the lines of things like drama or some of the ancient comedies, where you can kind of infer. It's almost like trying to read gesture. There's nothing that says now he pointed at such and such, but if you're willing to read it carefully and try to make inferences about what's going on in a place, you can start to read protest into the Agora as well.
The piece I would add, because I think it's really interesting, Samantha, to hear you talk about what else is going on in the Agora. And I would just point out that our public realm is the place for so much more than protest. It's what we can most visually sort of describe as a form of democracy. But, one of the interesting things to be in DC during COVID is there weren't very many visitors, right? And so who was on the mall and who was hanging in the parks were local residents, and those were also equally important to our democracy. So we can focus on the big things because they're photogenic and it's easy to describe, but I think it's really important that these are places where Althea is selling vegetables to buy her own freedom, or women are protesting in front of the White House. So multiple.
It's so important, Thaisa, and it ties into this notion of, what is urban order? What is order? And we hear the word order and we think of, very, very tightly planned streets, very geometrically organized places. But actually, I think the more formally organized something is, it's sort of a red flag that maybe it's not really being used in a way that one would hope it to be in a political society. And we often
really good examples, Tiananmen Square, right?
Yeah.
And we know what, and I think that's an example of a place that we understand the surveillance, we understand, that is not a place. And if stepping into that space, you are physically aware.
And yet it was designed for gathering, but not necessarily the kinds of gatherings that we're talking about.
Right.
And when people, even in antiquity, the Agora, now this is a shred of evidence that's often misused a lot in academia, where there was a person in the Hellenistic period who visited Athens and he said, oh, the place is a mess. The streets are crooked. It's just a mess. But actually, if you read the other parts of the descriptions, you can see that there's these beautiful understandings of the relationships between monuments in the city, and that by standing in the Agora, you can see the Acropolis. And so it's hard to say that is an orderly, that is a well-planned city. And so we also have to be willing to step back from this assumption that geometric order, that formal order, equates to the order in which we use things, but actually it's a different way of understanding order. And sometimes the places which look higgledy-piggledy or haphazard, often the very, very, very well organized spaces. I mean, just look at what people actually did during, not all, but some of the Occupy movements that were happening all over, but especially in New York and in London. We had one here in Dublin, but the London one was really interesting because that was not a public park. That was the forecourt of St. Paul's Cathedral. And there was a question, there was an ambiguity there on who actually controlled that space. But what happened was that when the Occupy movement took it over, first of all, they couldn't get kicked out because it wasn't city property. But then secondly, they were able to organize themselves in a very short amount of time. I mean, it looked like it was an encampment. People would go down there and be like, oh, it smells and it's like messy. But actually, they had an order worked out. They understood how to keep themselves in that boundary and how to use the different sections that they had marked out. And it may not have, fit into a plan and was tidy and orderly in the way that we are sort of trained to think, but they certainly had an order. They had, different facilities. They had different utilities available. They had food. They even had like a little library, and they were putting all these things into action. To me, that's order.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Clara. We are suffering a mental health crisis and an epidemic of solitude and isolation. How can public space help us redress that? And what would be some properties that those spaces would need to have in order to support mental health?
Boy, that's as Clara knows, thank you. Great question, Clara. And obviously what I would say is we need to invest in our public realm. I think that became obvious during COVID and that isolation. But I also think our public realm has to have many different kinds of places and spaces, right? We need those intimate places to be alone. We need the places for small gathering, big gathering, for protests, for celebrations. I guess what I would say, I think is really important is we need to make places that encourage engagement. And I'm thinking particularly of benches that are often lined up so that you're sitting, right? You don't face somebody. We tend to make many of our public places, in fact, hard to engage with people. So we need to do that more and encourage that and make citizenship part of our physical reality. I mean, that gets back to the social media piece, right? And come out and smell and eat with people and talk and listen and listen some more.
Thank you. That follows slightly on to the next question from Homa about what the effect is of, say, 80,000 people getting together in a sporting event or concert event in comparison to some of the historical things you've talked about.
I think anytime people get together for anything, short of, well, I have my own opinions about, certain things that I would gather with people to watch or be part of. But I think it's important that people, and if they find community over a soccer game, or a Taylor Swift concert or fireworks, we could argue about fireworks, but something like that. I think that is making community. And again, the question always comes up is where does that happen? And I think of the Marian Anderson event so important. And yes, partly it's important because it was resisting, for those who don't know, she had been denied the right to, or the capacity to perform in Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution. So it sort of denied that. But I think what it also did is it brought art and culture into the public realm with a huge audience of people who were there to hear her and be part of that community. And it was lots and lots of African Americans who may not have always felt welcome on the mall there, but it was also lots and lots of people just coming together to hear an incredible artist and to stand for why that's important in our democracy, in our public realm. So that's why that moment, I think, is such a pivotal, and it really allows then later for things like the I Have a Dream speech, and for the variety of ways. And I'm thinking in this case of the National Mall. So, to me, there are people that came to listen to Marian Anderson because it was a political statement. And there were people, I'm sure, who came to hear an incredible artist sing.
There's not a narrow doesn't have to be, and there wasn't in antiquity a narrow definition of what it means to be political. And we know actually that most sporting events do have a political element to them.
There are those of us who think it's all political.
Yeah.
Right. Where we choose to gather and what we choose to invest in is those gatherings. I think an undergirding question would be, how are we making decisions to invest in sporting stadiums versus in our public realm, and how many of sporting stadiums are essentially private enterprises? And, and then you're talking about access at a whole nother level. Very different level. So, that would be my piece. In there.
Thank you. We have one last question from the audience, from Stefan Purnell. Is there any Agora like something known from ancient Asia?
Gosh, so we do know that there was, we mentioned Tiananmen Square. I mean, Tiananmen Square is a fairly modern rendition of a very ancient pattern of building, and going back to Xi'an in China. And I would really hesitate to call that something like an agora. But certainly those were political gathering spaces and used for mass movement. And then they were exported to Japan and Korea. But not that I would have to actually look into that some more to be able to answer it squarely. But I'm not that
I mean, I think part of is what we're looking for is the equivalent to, right? And I think that's probably not as helpful as asking, have other cultures thought about placemaking?
Absolutely, they have. Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
govern and how people engage. And I would argue, yes, they all have. Right? The great city of Zimbabwe has very clear places where people engage in different scales. So I showed the tree of great peace, which was the Iroquois tree. I think that cultures that have come together to govern have generally made place for that. Do they all equal democratic space like the Agora? No, I think they're different, but I think
I agree, Thaisa, and this is something that Mana Aga and I are working on for going forward. It's how democracy isn't something that is owned by Greek history, and it's really important to be able to break away from that standard assumption that the Agora is this archetype, because it's not. It never was to the Greeks either, and that there is that real flexibility and understanding that very different cultures can have similar expressions, but it doesn't mean it's architectural expression.
I'm going to sneak in one last question, if that's okay, from Alana Walsh. Are there any other readings or information out there about such ideas and thoughts on the public realm that you would recommend, especially your own, I think?
I can fill her in later in the week. I mean, I am sometimes the most sort of insightful and sort of laser sharp questions are coming from outside of our disciplines. Thais and I cover a lot of different disciplines in a way, and the nature of our work requires that. But I think I mentioned Richard Sennett earlier. He's a sociologist who's has always been very compelled to talk about the city, and he's one of the first places where I had a conversation with him over 20 years ago about the notion of permeable boundaries in cities, and how it's like he describes it as being like a cell of a body that has this fluidity to it and allows many things in, but not everything in. And people like Hannah Arendt, who have written very, very beautifully on the notion of space of appearance, and having discussions at a table, and understanding the sort of something as solid as a table as understanding a democratic space. So it's a huge field to look at, and there's so many different ways to go down. I don't know if Thaisa, if you could. It's massive,
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would just say is I think much of it has been focused either on the people or the architecture. And what Samantha and I are trying to do is bring attention to the ground and the land, and to understand the importance of those places as central to this conversation.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to hand back over to Professor Mahmoudi now to finish us off.
Thank you so much, Doctors Martin and Wei. That was a very wonderful presentation. There's so much to really think about and reflect on, especially in relation to the current climate that we live under in relation to conflict, polarization, this binary concept, the us and them, and how do we use public spaces better for dialogue, for meaningful understanding of other people's perspectives and their understanding of our perspective, and maybe bringing us closer to coming up with more constructive solutions to the many problems that we face. So I sincerely thank you for your presentations. In a way, both of you coming from the places that you do in terms of your expertise really made this a very full and rich presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now to our audience, I want to remind you of our next event, which is going to be the Baha'i Chair's 2023 annual lecture. And our speaker is Amanda Ripley, who is an investigative journalist and a New York Times best-selling author. She writes for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and other outlets. Her interests are about human behavior and change. And so the title of her talk is Breaking the Spell of High Conflict. If you go to our website or follow us on social media, you will know how to sign up for this event, but it's not virtual. It's on the campus of University of Maryland in the Student Union building, the Stamp Student Union, in the Grand Ballroom. It takes place at 7 p.m. on October 19, and we really encourage you to try to join us if you can. But I also encourage you to follow us on our social media, because that's the way we continue to announce all of our future events. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this wonderful program, and of course to both Doctors Martin and Wei for their very enlightening topic and conversation and lecture. Thank you again. Bye-bye.